Hey, what's up everybody? A few days ago I posted a video that walked through creating a set of stock trading APIs using Go. Today in this video I'd like to show you how to add OAuth using ForgeRock's identity platform into the flow so that we can enforce authorization on some of those APIs. These concepts are described in Neil Madden's new book, API Security in Action from Manning Publications. Neil and Manning Publications were kind enough to share a discount code for viewers of this channel. Stay tuned. At the end of this video, I'll share that code so that you can save 35% off the price of Neil's book, API Security in Action. All right, let's get started. So I'll assume the ForgeRock platform has already been installed and that it's up and running. First things we need to do is set up the authorization service in AM, also known as the Access Manager. Let's go ahead and log in and we'll go ahead and create that first. We'll go ahead and create that realm. All right, so we'll call this realm Customers Realm, leave all the defaults. All right, so once that's created, the first thing we need to do is set up the authorization service in AM. So generally speaking, it's best practice create new realms for your customizations. This allows you to secure the root realm, and also you can still access the root realm if you make a mistake and lose access to the sub realm. We'll call this realm Customers Realm. We can leave the rest of the settings with their defaults. I'm using all lower cases in the realm name because it becomes part of the URI. I think it's easier when the URI is all lowercase. Probably some lessons learned from starting my career on a Unix platform. Now that we have our new realm, we need to create the authorization service, create some identities, and set up our application profiles. From the Choose Service drop-down, select OAuth 2 Provider. We'll keep the defaults for now. Go ahead and click Create. We only need to make a couple of changes to the settings after the provider is created. So let's use client-based access tokens and refresh tokens. This enables us to use OAuth-based JSON web tokens or JOTs. Next, I want to enable Use Policy Engine for scope decisions. This setting enables the option to use AM's authorization service to dynamically grant a scope. I'll go over this in a little bit more detail later on. So go ahead and save that. Pro tip, before you switch to any other tab, make sure you hit Save Changes because you'll lose any changes you made when you switch tabs. Now, you don't need to change any of the OAuth 2 provider settings for our purposes today, but more than likely in your environment, you'd want to change some of the encryption settings and the response types. All right, so let's add some users now. AM is reading the users from the connected LDAP service. I'm using ForgeRock's directory service, formerly known as OpenDJ. Ideally, in a real environment, identities would be provisioned from another system and you wouldn't be adding users manually. So I just need a few demo users today and I'm going to go ahead and create those. We'll click on Add Identity and we'll add the user ID, the password, and the email address. All right, once that's created, make sure the changes are saved. We'll go back to identities and we'll go ahead and create a second user as well. Just follow the same steps as before. All right, if we go back to the Identities tab, we can see all of our identities, all of our users have been created and listed out here. All right, so our next step, we're going to add a couple of OAuth 2 clients. You can find these under Applications OAuth 2. Think of these applications or clients as the services that will be interacting with our authorization service. They are either applications that are requesting tokens or resource servers that need to validate tokens included in requests to resources. In our little world today, the resources are the APIs that we're going to protect. If you're new to OAuth or you have some questions about this, feel free to add a comment below. I'll be more than happy to get some more details to you. Okay, so our first client for this application, we're going to call this TraderGo app. We give it a client secret. The redirect URL, this is the URL that the authorization service will send back the code. We're using authorization code grant flow. So the authorization service will send back a code, which then the client will use to request the access token. So go ahead and put this in here. Full disclosure, this is a bogus redirection URL. We're going to be using Postman. I'll show this in detail once we get to Postman. But typically, this has to be a legitimate URL that can handle and knows what to do with the code once it's received. All right. Next, we're going to add the scopes, and these are the scopes that are expected to be requested by the client and then presented to the resource servers via the token. So we're going to have two scopes. We're going to add trader, and we're going to have trader go admin. These are the scopes that are going to be used in the authorization policies by the resource server to determine if a user should be allowed access to a particular resource. We'll dig into these a little bit more in a few minutes. I'm going to leave the default scopes blank. Default scopes are automatically added to the token whether the client requests them or not. So we don't need to do this for now. I'm going to click create. And we'll go ahead and add our second client, which this is for the resource server. The resource server is going to be a slightly different configuration in that we don't need a redirect URI, as this service is only inspecting tokens from other clients. But to be able to read those tokens, this particular client needs elevated permissions. ForgeRock's created a specific scope to allow that. It's called AM introspect all tokens. You're going to want to be careful with this scope because, like I said before, it gives permissions to read the contents of all tokens. Okay, you want to make sure you click create, and then once that, at this point, we're finished with AM, at least for now, and we now need to add some changes to the identity gateway, also known as IG, to be able to actually use the OAuth services we just set up. So let's go ahead and open IG now. A couple of points first with IG. By default, IG installs in production mode, which prevents the studio or console, which you see here, from displaying. This is for additional security so that you don't expose the administrative console in a production environment. If you do enable this, which I've done for the demo, make sure you revert back to production mode before you expose this service to users. Secondly, all of IG's configurations are saved in JSON files, and IG can and should actually be managed by changing those instead of using the UI. In earlier versions of IG, there were issues when switching between managing the configurations for the UI and also using the config files. The recommendation was usually just to disable the UI and make all your changes via config files. That's typically what I do on customer implementations. But I find it a little bit easier to explain the process visually, so that's why I'm using the UI for this demo. All right, so let's create our first route. Let's see here. We're gonna use structured and the Okay, so this is the URI for our APIs. Our Golang application is listening on port 10,000. We have an endpoint called stocks, and this is the DNS to that entry. So once we create that, IG will automatically split the URL that we entered apart and into the base URI and the condition. IG uses the condition when it receives a request to determine which route to use to process request. Here's a pro tip. If there are multiple routes that the request could match the condition on, then IG will select the first one it encounters. You can manage this by naming your routes using numbers. For example, O1, O1 hyphen file name, O2 hyphen file name, etc. IG will start at the files with the lowest number, so that you can use that to make sure that IG is hitting the right route first. I'm not going to add any filters to the stocks route. I'm not going to add any filters to the stocks route. This is going to be just a reverse proxy. Okay, so now that we've saved the stocks route, let's go back to the main screen. If you notice, the new route says undeployed. That means that the live server does not have the changes we made, so we need to go ahead and deploy that. All right, so pretty easy there. Okay, so now it's been deployed, we can start sending requests through IG to our API. So let's jump over to Postman. All right, so let's take a look here at our get all stocks endpoint. Now, when we go directly to the application, we can see that the port number is 10,000. So this is not using IG yet. Send the request. All right, so it actually helps when we make sure our application is running. And now we can see here, we get all of the stocks back. So now what happens when we change and we go directly to the gateway? So you can see here, we're now going to the gateway.trader.go hostname, and we're using 9443 as the port. So this is going to trigger the stocks route that we just created, and absolutely nothing happens. But that's exactly what we want. So by putting IG in front of the application, we're simply acting as a reverse proxy and didn't want to cause any disruptions to the users consuming this application. The mantra for most folks that work in information security is to not be noticed. If customers aren't noticing your changes, then you're doing your job right. Now, like I said before, we don't have any filters in this route, and that's okay because we want customers to be able to get to the stock information. But what happens when we have more sensitive endpoints? Like, how about returning all users or other admin type services? So if we switch over to the get all users, and we go directly to the application, so that our URL is directly to the Go application, we can see we return all of the users. So we should probably limit this to just admins or users that have the Trader Go admin scope. So let's go back over to IG and create a new route. So this route is going to be called /admin. We go ahead and create the app. We create the route. Now once we have the route, let's just deploy it to make sure it gets out there okay. So at this point it's very similar, there's no filters, but now we're going to go ahead and add a filter to it. We're going to add the authorization. We're going to add authorization to this. I want to use the OAuth2 resource server, and there's a few settings on here that we're going to want to change. So first of all, we're going to change to the introspection endpoint, and for the URL, So we're going to, and if you notice here, we're going to go actually to the introspection endpoint that's in our customer's realm. So the client name, we're using the resource server. And then for the password, this is the password that we created in the profile. We're going to evaluate scope statically. And the scope here that we is the trader go admin. So this means you have to have the scope trader go admin in your access token to be able to get access to this endpoint. We'll go ahead and save that, deploy it again. So now if we go back over to Postman and we change to our gateway, so here we are going through IG, going to admin users, and you see we get a 401 unauthorized. If we take a peek at the actual request that's sent, we can see it's pretty simple and there's no authorization, no access token that was included in the headers of that. So how do we get an authorization token into our request? Well, I'm glad you asked. We can do this by sending a request to the authorization endpoint. There's a few steps here, and I'm going to use Postman to step through them now. So first, we need an authenticated user. Since I'm using Postman and I'm not allowing redirects, IG is not going to be able to direct the user to the login page if we go to the authorization endpoint first. So for this demo, I'm going to use the authenticate endpoint. And this is pretty simple, and you can see I'm going to log in with the user K2me, which we created earlier in AM in the identities. And this is the password I created. And just double check here to make sure you go into the correct realm. If you mistakenly go to the root realm instead, you're not going to be able to authenticate. So let's see, what did we do wrong here? All right, so real simple, easiest way to fix this. I'm assuming it's a bad password. We'll just go in. Jump back over, and we see, in fact, it was a bad password. So here's the password, and we get back the token ID. So the next thing we need to do as the client So the next thing we need to do as a client, we need to send we need to send the user to the authorized endpoint. So you can see here in the parameters, I have to include the redirect URI, and this has to match what we put in the profile. We're including the token ID from the authentication in the CSRF header to make things a little bit easier. Since we don't have a UI to interface with the user, we're going ahead and assuming the user is consenting to this, and that's about it. So we'll go ahead and send this. And you see we get a 302. We got to look here at the headers to be able to see that the code. So it goes back to the redirect URI that I mentioned before, and we see the code listed here. So that's exactly what we were hoping for at this point. Okay, so now that we have that, what we're going to do is we're going to act as the client, and we're going to send that code, which is here, and we're going to send it to the access token endpoint. And so basically this is the client asking for the token. So you see we get that token back, and to verify what is in this token, we can easily do that. You just want to decode that, and there's actually a real handy debugger over here on Jot.io, so we can drop this token in, and we can see here's all the information that's actually in the token. So here's the user that was authenticated, and we can see here the scopes include trader go admin and trader. So let's go ahead and jump back over to Postman, and let's get all users a shot one more time. So we're going to continue to get a 401 until we actually include the token into the header. So it's at the, kind of a rookie mistake here, continuing to send the request without the authorization header. So we can easily fix that. Go in and we select bearer token. So at this point, because I'd set it up before, that is going to include the access token into the request. We take a look and we can see how our request has changed from earlier where we just had this first line. So now we're actually including the authorization bearer token for that user. Now when we send the request, we get back a 200 and we get all the users returned as we were expecting. So another pro tip, you probably noticed that I'm actually not manually copying any of these over. Most people that are familiar with and use Postman on a regular basis, they use scripting in the test tab, and just when you get a response where you need information in that response for the next step in the flow, you can save that off into an environment variable and then specify that in the next request using Postman's substitution syntax. It's pretty handy. It saves you from typos. It saves you from copying and paste where you forget you don't highlight the whole string when you copy and paste. Saves you a lot of time. So I highly recommend taking a look at that if you haven't already. Okay, so great. Now we're requiring users to authenticate and have a valid access token with the right scopes. But at this point, anyone can authenticate and authorize this token. So how do we restrict access to only admins that can authorize a valid token for this client? So let's jump back over to AM. And what we're going to do now is create an authorization policy that will dynamically restrict the admin token based on membership of an admin group. Okay, so now that we're here, click on authorization, click on policy sets. We're going to use the default OAuth 2 scopes policy set. You have to use this, otherwise AM won't actually pick up the change when you're making requests to create the access tokens. So we click in here. Now what we want to do is add a new policy, and let's call this admin scope policy. And for a resource type, let's call it OAuth 2 scope. Use the wildcard for the pattern, and then for you want to replace this wildcard with the name of the scope. Make sure to add that and hit create. Okay, so now that we're looking at the summary, you see that we have resources, the name of the scope, pretty bare bones at this point. So what we want to do is add an action. You add grant, and we're going to select deny. Save those changes. So we see that we're adding that now. Next thing we want to do is we want to add our subjects so that the policy knows who are the users that are allowed to do this. So you click the pencil, and first thing you do is you want to get rid of this default, this never match. You want to add a new subject condition, call it users and groups, and the group we want is admins. All right, we want to change this to not. And so basically, if we save that and we go back and look at our summary, we can see so the scope trader go admin is denied if the user is not in the admins group. That's exactly what we want to do. So let's go back and double check that we have a user, and the user is actually, there's a user in this group. So we go into groups, go into admins. There's no users, so let's go ahead and add K2Me to this group. right, so let's just jump back to the policy real quick. Take a look at the summary here, and like I said, so this effectively is saying do not grant the TraderGo admin scope if the user is not in the admins group. All right, so let's test this out and see how it works. So make sure you delete the cookies so that we are forced to re-authenticate. That's a pretty good habit to remember when you're working with Postman and AM, is to delete cookies frequently. Otherwise, you tend to forget in that you're still logged in and you're sending authenticated traffic to AM. And sometimes this can get unexpected outcomes because you're still logged in as a different user. So I typically, just about every time, I very frequently will delete those session cookies. All right, so let's go back to our authenticate. Logging in as K2Me. We get the token. We request the authorization code. We see that was successful. We're going to exchange that, and good. We're still able to get the even after that policy is enabled. We're still able. K2Me is still able to consent. Excuse me, for that token to be created. The client can make the request to get all users, and everything looks good. So let's mix things up a little bit at this point. This time we're going to go back. Again, let's go ahead and delete those cookies. And this time we're going to log in. Instead of K2Me, we're going to log it as B2Me. Now, if you remember, we didn't add B2Me. We didn't add B2Me. Probably a bad password again. Let me just jump over there. Okay, perfect. So this user's B2Me successfully authenticated. We're going to step through, and we see that we get a code. Now we're going to exchange that code and get a new access token. So let's take a look at this access token real quick before we go any further. We're going to replace and take a look at it. So we see subject is B2Me. Perfect. Scopes. We definitely see something different here. We don't have the TraderGo admin scope. So let's see what happens when this token is used to request and get all users. So we can see here we got a 403 forbidden. Perfect. It's exactly what I was hoping for, exactly what we wanted. So now that we send that request, we get a 403 forbidden. So we can see that IG is inspecting the token and seeing that this request, this token that's included request, does not have the right scope, and therefore is not allowing access to this resource. Okay, so to wrap up, in AM we set up the authorization service, we created identities, we created application profiles. In IG we created 2 routes and added authorization to one of them. And lastly, we created an authorization policy in AM that only allows the admin scope to be minted with the access token when the authenticated user is part of the admin group. It's not bad for a few minutes of work. All right, as I promised, I have the discounted Neil Madden's book, API Security in Action. So head over to Manning Publishing and use the code, the discount code MaddenPC. I'll put that up on the screen. You get 35% off of Neil Madden's book. So thanks for tuning in. Have a great day.